you today. Okay. For those watching online, the lighting is not good in here, so I don't. Which is probably fun that you can't see me as well. So in chapter 21, verse 17, Paul is back in Jerusalem. He undergoes a Jewish purification rite. About these dozen or so verses here in the middle of 21. Again, does Paul have any interest in going through a Jewish purification rite? I mean, he's Jewish by birth, he's a Pharisee, so he's probably well versed in it. But ever since converting to Christianity, he doesn't seem to have any interest in Jewish traditions or rites. But again, he was nervous about coming back to Jerusalem because he had faced pushback about all these non-Jewish folks that he was kind of welcoming into the fold. And so, like last week, we saw he had Timothy circumcised. He's willing to make concessions in order to try and have some unity in the group. So he offers this concession, if you will. He goes through this rite of purification for at least a week, it sounds like. But it doesn't quite work out for him. Come verses 27 and 28, we have some Jewish folks who come down and say, hey, this Paul guy, because he's been in the temple area, they accuse him of defiling the temple by having these Gentiles, these non-Jewish folks, in parts of the temple where Gentiles couldn't be. So there were kind of different layers or levels, if you will, of the temple where certain people could be. And so they accused Paul of defiling the temple by having these dirty Gentiles within the temple, whether that was actually true or not. And so this, in a sense, is the beginning of the end for Paul. So he is arrested here, and then the remainder of the book of Acts, he will be on trial, he'll be interrogated, he gets eventually sent off to Rome. So this is kind of the start of that entire process for Paul. I want to point out in verse 36, so all this is happening kind of on the steps of the temple or near the temple. In verse 36, we have this crowd, this mob shouting to arrest Paul, and they keep saying, away with him. Well, if you think back to Jesus when he's on trial, right, kind of a similar location, very similar shout from the crowd as well. So Paul is kind of undergoing the very same thing that his Lord and Savior went through some 30 years prior. I think that's all we need to say about chapter 21. Paul has many defenses that he will launch into here. Chapter 22, verses 1 through 21, he begins to defend himself in front of this mob, so he's still kind of right in front of the temple. He retells his call story. Again, Paul, throughout Acts, and especially throughout all of his letters, right, because he was not one of the 12 disciples. We don't necessarily hear that he was maybe a part of the whole Jesus movement, right? He's initially persecuting the Jesus movement. So throughout all of his letters, the poor guy is just trying to let people know, hey, I am qualified to proclaim the gospel message, right? He might not have been one of the original 12, but he's constantly trying to defend his credentials, that God actually has called him to proclaim this message to the Gentiles. So for 21 straight verses here, he defends himself in front of this mob that wants to do away with him. And then in verse 28, so he is, right, there's Roman centurions, in a sense Roman officials here who are a part of this arresting tribunal. You get to verse 26, 27, and 28 of chapter 22. They're starting to flog Paul. They're starting to treat him fairly aggressively as a criminal. And it's at this point in the book of Acts that Paul finally reveals that he is a Roman citizen. Why he has waited up until this point to reveal fairly prominent information, I don't know. He kind of saved it for a last gasp here. So as he's beginning to be flogged and treated, in a sense, like someone who won't be a Roman citizen, he kind of raises his hand and says, is this how we treat Roman citizens around here? We kind of arrest them and treat them poorly and treat them almost as if they're guilty first and then kind of figure out if it's true or not.
But doesn't that make you think that he gave up on the thought of Christ? I mean, all of this time, like you said, he hasn't done anything, and all of a sudden he's bringing this up. It's like, is he at a point where he figures he's going to die and God's not with him?
I don't know about that. Perhaps he just considers, I mean, I don't know if you consider it a gift that he's a Roman citizen, but perhaps just using
But like you said, waiting this long, why was,
I think it's political.
they weren't
timing.
following him before.
political timing. Yeah, that could be part of it. Up until this point, I suppose he hasn't faced this intense of persecution, especially from Roman officials. Typically, he's facing persecution from his fellow Jewish brothers and sisters to whom appealing to Roman citizenship would have meant nothing. I kind of find it just, he probably has a smirk on his face. I feel like when he's kind of saying this here.
Well, the centurion came and said, "What are you doing? You're about to beat a Roman citizen. You really want to do that?"
Yeah, so I think he uses it here as kind of a get out of jail free card, which is a good time, right? Perhaps he's been waiting for this moment to play this card.
But as Andrew said, it wasn't Paul that first said, it was a centurion that said this guy is a Roman citizen. And Paul just confirmed that.
Yeah,
It
well,
was
he
a
asked
cen-
me-
He asked
He
the
asked the
centurion,
question.
"Is it illegal for you to beat a Roman citizen?" The centurion was like, "Wait a second, this guy's a Roman." Then
Oh, I
it
see.
sounds like the centurion
Yep.
went to the tribune.
Yep, I
Yeah, it's
see.
interesting
What
how
you guys
they.
about to do? You're about to beat a Roman citizen. You're gonna cause some issues here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know how they know that Paul is a Roman citizen
And how you
here.
prove it.
But when they had tied him up with thongs, Paul said to the centurion
Yeah.
who was standing by, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who is uncondemned?"
Yeah.
When the centurion heard that, he went to the tribunal and
that's-
said to him, "What are you about to do? This man is a Roman citizen."
Yeah, so
he
Paul.
came.
So Paul's
Paul
the first.
mentioned it to the centurion.
Right.
Yeah, so
and
Paul-
the centurion
Paul-
went his way
Yeah.
by
Oh, so
as a
yeah.
Roman
Yeah.
Yeah,
citizen.
so
I was
Paul
in there.
mentions, yeah, so
Yeah.
Paul mentions it first.
First.
Yeah, that's kind of a get out of jail free card, which then will start a whole process.
Do you know
here
who I am?
for the remainder? Yeah, in a sense, for the remainder of the book of Acts here.
Feel like that's getting pulled over and be like, "But I'm the sheriff."
Kind of, in a sense. Paul is laying pretty hefty because there's a lot of rights that come with being a Roman citizen. And so, in a sense, he's starting a particular legal process that he assumes is going to be in his favor, but ironically will not be in his favor by the time it's all.
Would it also
It's
be
all
fairly
set.
uncommon for a Jew to go through a Jewish or a Roman citizen to go through a Jewish cleansing ceremony? Or were Romans converting to Judaism?
Well, but Paul is he's Jewish and Roman by birth, in a
Yeah,
sense.
he's
so
he's a mix.
Yeah, he's got a mixed background.
Had Paul at this point, and I'm trying to remember now, I should know this, but had he received his commission to go to Rome yet at this point, or did he receive that later after this event?
Did he receive like a commission from like Christ or?
Yes, right.
Yeah, in a sense, that would have come all before this
Okay.
particular moment.
So maybe, and he's a lawyer, he was a very clever man as well.
Mhm.
Maybe now that I'm in the hands of the Romans, okay, well, this can maybe hurry that process along.
Can get me up to Rome. Yeah,
You know, I don't.
yeah, because it finishes with him getting to Rome, but he's under house arrest. So he gets to Rome in a way that he probably was not expected to get to Rome.
But that's, one could say that's what God expected. I mean, it was God's plan that all of this occurred, is my
Yeah.
feeling.
I think he miscalculates a little bit, especially when he appeals to Caesar, as we'll come to see.
He should have kept his mouth shut.
Yes, but you could argue that, right, maybe this is exactly where God wanted him to end up, but it looks like maybe he miscalculates a little bit. But that's not to say that God can't, right, when we kind of jump over the guardrails, it's not to say that God can't.
Well, I mean, and then we're assuming he was killed while you know, that, we don't know that for sure.
Acts doesn't report that, but yeah,
Right.
that's the,
I mean,
he's killed up in Rome.
well, where does it say that?
Well, tradition.
Well,
holds that.
tradition, right, but
So history.
Correct, if you're looking for a biblical source, we don't have it.
I mean, because when he writes to the Philippians, when he's imprisoned, he's saying, I'm confident I will be seeing you soon. I mean,
Yeah, so something goes sideways for,
according to tradition.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah. Yes, tradition has, yes, that he's killed in Rome, so. Okay,
Quick question.
yeah,
He gets pulled in front of them after he's been untied, and says the priest orders someone to strike him in the jaw or the mouth. And Paul, at this point, Paul says, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall." What?
oh, in verse 3,
Why is he? Is that just some sort of insult? What is he
Reminiscent.
calling them when he calls them a whitewashed wall? What is he?
it's reminiscent of what Jesus, he had said somewhat similar things. Right, my footnotes say it's referencing a wall with cracks that's been painted over to hide the faults.
Oh,
So it's kind of the landlord special, if you will. Yeah,
got it.
you just kind of paint over all the walls and say, hey, look at this is. There's nothing to see here. No cracks, no bumps, no holes. We're just
Got
gonna
it.
quick slap a fresh coat of paint on it and call it brand new. So whitewash, well, yeah, meaning that they're kind of pretending to be high and mighty and holy.
That makes sense. Thank you.
But the God, so this is in chapter 23 now, which is good. So Paul first goes before the Sanhedrin, so the Jewish ruling council. He'll then get elevated to kind of the governor of Judea or Israel. The king of Israel will eventually get involved, and then Paul eventually goes to Caesar. So he kind of slowly makes his way up the legislative and political branches here. But he's first before the Sanhedrin. So he once again makes his defense before his fellow Jewish brothers and sisters. His claim is pretty straightforward. Paul is a Pharisee. The Pharisees believe in the resurrection of the dead. Let's say that they're 50% of the Jewish faction. The other 50%, let's say, is the Sadducees. This is oversimplifying. The Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection of the dead. That's why they're so sad, you see.
Oh my gosh.
Right? That's how you can remember
It's
it.
a good one.
It's the children's
It's
thing.
a song.
No.
But so he appeals, in a sense, to half of the Sanhedrin by saying, all I've been doing in my travels is proclaiming that someone was raised from the dead, which about half of you already, right, kind of have in your theological back pocket, right? You believe in the resurrection of the dead. I'm just saying that this Jesus of Nazareth is the one who has been raised from the dead. I'm also calling him Messiah and Lord and attaching more titles to him. But Paul's saying what I'm preaching isn't necessarily completely out of line with Jewish thought, right? There's already a good amount of Jews who believe in the resurrection of the dead, right? Again, Paul is a pretty smart cookie, so he kind of knows how to defend himself, and that's one of his defenses, is that he's really not stepping too far outside the bounds of Jewish thought. Does it work for him? I think, again, some folks might believe him, many folks are still quite angry with him. A plot is formed by some folks, some troublemakers within the Jewish ranks, that they're gonna kill Paul. I think it's Paul's nephew hears of this plot and attempt on Paul's life. Paul appeals again to a couple of the folks in charge, and he gets transferred from Jerusalem up to Caesarea because of this plot to kill him. So then in chapter 24, he lines up a little further
Something's a little
north.
weird in this. If Paul's in jail, it seems like he has an awkward amount of sway over the centurions
There's a
that are
lot.
guarding him, because he tells the centurion, "Hey, take this guy to the Sadducees or to the tribune," and he's got a message from the centurion's like, "Oh, all right." That seems weird to me.
Throughout these remaining chapters of Acts, Paul has incredible, not only Paul, but kind of his inner circle, seemingly have this incredible amount of freedom and still sway over like the process that's unfolding.
Yeah.
It reminds me of when the Gospels will describe Jesus is preaching and teaching. There gets to be this crowd that's upset with him. Right, at one point we're told there's a crowd that wants to throw him off a cliff. And we're told that Jesus just walks right through the crowd, right? And he just, it's not that he kind of, skirted or, snuck out the back door and no one saw him leave, but he just walked literally right through a crowd that wants to throw him off a cliff, and he just walks away scot-free. So it feels like for Paul here, although he is under arrest, there still feels like there's this divine thing on the side that's still helping him proclaim the gospel, kind of get out of awkward situations, have people on the side help him out. So he's both under arrest, but still has, I think,
He has almost like Jedi mind powers. Take this man to the council real quick and let them hear what he
Yeah.
has to say.
which I feel like it's
Sure.
still God at work.
Yeah.
I
Oh yeah,
think.
100%.
He has his armor on.
I think so, right? So even though things are going sideways for Paul, there's still God at work, which I think is a good reminder for us. And even when it feels like things are working against us, we still have God working for us. Absolutely, yeah. And that's exactly how the book of Acts will end too, with this positive note in the midst of things going wrong. So chapter 23, yes, he was before the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. He gets transferred northward to Caesarea. This is where in chapter 24, right, so at the start of 24, the high priest, some of the elders also moved northward to where Paul is being kept. The governor of Judea, Felix, who is hostile to the Jews but also knows something about Christianity. Paul now makes his case before this guy named Felix, right? So this is how Acts ends. It's just Paul meeting different levels of officials and kind of retelling his defense story. In verse 22 of chapter 24. Let's see. Verse 25. Yeah, because Felix is hostile to the Jews. Felix is also kind of a bankrupt leader, which, I don't know. I don't want to talk politics in politics season, but I don't know. Sometimes leaders can not be as great as we like them to be. So Paul, in verse 25, Paul is discussing justice, self-control, and the coming judgment. And this Felix guy, the governor, becomes frightened because although Felix probably doesn't have a lot of self-awareness, I think he knows that he's probably not the best guy on the block, right? He knows that he's done some maybe nefarious things. And here he's got this Paul guy talking about justice and judgment and self-control, and Felix probably starts sweating a little bit. Wait a second, Paul, you're convicting me here. And I don't think Felix really ever got convicted. Go away for the present. For when I have an opportunity, I will send for you. So in verse 20, so Paul gets sent away for a couple of years, right? Felix doesn't quite know what to do with him, so he just sends him away under house arrest for a couple of years until Felix is then succeeded in a sense by Festus. So the cycle just continues for Paul.
It seems like in verse 27, a little bit in verse 28, it talks about Paul's heritage maybe being a factor in how he's being treated by not only the Jews, but certainly by anybody that's a Roman citizen, the Romans if they're involved in punishment, or it goes back somewhat, I think, to his background, his upbringing. He knows people,
Yeah,
and so that's maybe part of where some of his sway comes from.
true.
I don't know.
Yeah, he's kind of a child of both worlds, right? Jewish, Roman, is well versed on both sides of that theological and political aisle, which again is maybe why God called him
In the first place.
in particular,
Yeah.
because
Because
he
of his
just
background.
has the credentials and across
ability
the
and
board.
skill to, a
Mhm.
good speaker, a good, he can, on behalf of himself, he can make a
Mhm.
positive case.
Uh-huh.
And so that's, yeah, that's probably why he
That's
was
fair
called.
too. Yeah.
Does he have physical characteristics that he kind of looks Roman? And where was he born?
In Tarsus.
Where is that?
It's in northwest.
Cilicia. It's, southern Turkey.
Oh.
Yeah, eastern
Okay.
side of the Mediterranean.
So he probably has a proud Roman nose.
Well,
I
you
think
know,
it-
a lot of times, unfortunately, people are judged by their
Mhm.
physical
I
characteristics.
think he's often
so-
described later, like late tradition history, as kind of really short, kind of an odd looking fellow,
I thought he was like
balding.
really tall.
No, I think he's described as kind of this unassuming.
I just-
Well, he had power before he changed his name. 'Cause
Yeah.
Paul, not a tax collector.
No, he was a Pharisee.
Pharisee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he had power before, and so any perceived reminiscence of that power is going to be treaded on carefully, because I mean, you don't start fighting with Pharisee.
Yeah, so he has standing within the Jewish ranks, which I think
Exactly.
allows him and gives him credentials to walk into temples in different cities. He's not just Joe Schmo off the corner. He is a Pharisee, but also a Roman.
Exactly. So he gets protection from. They can't stop him from walking in, and they can't persecute him because they don't have the power to.
Yeah. So we can see why he was called by Jesus for this
perfect mix.
particular.
And,
For this particular
and the
role.
followers in the way, I mean, they saw, I mean, so he had great sway with them because they've seen, I mean, wasn't he the one that, healed the guy that fell out of the window?
He was.
Right, I mean, so, I mean, if you have three kind of, the Jewish folks, the Romans folks, and then the common folk that were following him, I mean, held him in great regard.
True. Ironically, I think the people the inner circle, right? Kind of the 12 disciples, the inner core of believers in Jerusalem, probably. It's hard to say if they disliked him the most or what, because you don't necessarily hear about them coming to Paul's defense in these moments, right? You don't hear Peter standing up and saying, "Hey, well, we know this guy's with us." Like it feels like, because like we said back in chapter 14, that inner circle kind of is. This is Paul's story from here on out. I think they were still suspicious of this guy who had been persecuting the church. He's kind of leaving behind Jewish tradition and rules to bring in all these Gentiles. So you can see how Paul, if you are a Jewish believer, Paul's kind of changing the rules a bit. It feels like he is.
And wasn't James, was that Jesus' brother James that was
Is
kind
the
of the head?
leader of the Jerusalem church.
You don't hear anything from James.
He
Do
gives a
you?
speech in chapter 15.
But after that, I mean, as Paul is going through all of this,
He is given a warm, in chapter 21, we were told that Paul was given in verse 17, when we arrived in Jerusalem, the brothers, in a sense meaning the inner circle, welcomed us warmly. The next day, Paul went with us to visit James, and all the elders were present. So it feels like he's getting a warm welcome from
that.
the inner circle. And it's kind of these troublemakers off to the side that eventually accuse Paul of defiling the temple. But it feels like initially there's a warm welcome, but I don't know, it's hard to say how warm that welcome remains.
Cause it looks like Felix probably would have let him out of jail before he left,
Mm-hmm.
but he wanted to grant favor to the Jews and what they did. So there's this group of
There's
Jewish people who are like wanting to get rid of Paul.
there's politics involved.
Yeah.
It was interesting, maybe I'm sure it's in the other, translations, but, it says in verse 24 that Felix had a Jewish wife, Drusilla.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering how that affected his relationship with everyone else that he was dealing with.
Yeah, that I guess I can't speak to, but I would assume that it
create possibly some sympathy or whatever.
Potentially.
He was dangerous. That's what-
Yeah, Felix is hostile to the Jews.
Yeah, well, in one commentary, it says that Felix, left him in jail,
Mhm.
until the new.
Until the new guy comes. He
Yeah.
just doesn't know what to do with
Yeah.
Paul.
So,
Yeah.
I don't think there was a break there, based on what the commentary says.
Yeah,
Maybe it's not that clear, but.
yeah.
Paul is ridiculously dangerous to the Pharisees. too.
He's dangerous to the Pharisees.
Yeah, imagine we're all, Pharisees, and all of a sudden I go, y'all are wrong, and I'm gonna go tell all the people out there that you're supposed to be leading them, that y'all are wrong.
I don't think he's saying they're wrong.
Well, not wrong, but he's leading them away from the teaching of the rest of the Pharisees in a meaningful and convincing way.
Somewhat. He's basically just saying all these things that we believe in,
Mhm.
we're just attaching all this to Jesus.
Exactly.
When I don't think a lot of, or at least some Jews did want to attach those beliefs to.
Exactly, but it's also to start taking power away from the Pharisees and as a byproduct. He's the byproduct of his existence and his belief system being changed towards Jesus Christ and towards Christianity and the resurrection and the forgiveness of our sins through the sacrifice of Jesus is to see one of the leaders change their mind. I think about it like if a Republican or a Democrat switched parties, it makes national news all of a sudden because now it's more or less admitting that the people you were with were wrong. And that's kind of what it looks like.
Yeah.
The perceived from the public would be something like that, I would assume. So it
Yeah.
makes him
Paul's probably seen as an outcast by everybody, though, right? He probably still claims Pharisee background, but his fellow Pharisees would say, well, you're long since left from our group and party. But yeah, there's power
It's like
dynamics
the-
at play.
and it's all a side. It's a consequence, not a reason, if that makes sense.
Yeah. There's certainly power. There's politics involved here. There's power dynamics involved here. Absolutely across the board. In 25, so Paul's been hanging out for a couple of years. There's a new sheriff in town. They still don't know what to do with Paul. And then in verse 11 of chapter 25, I think Paul makes a miscalculation. So at the very end of verse 11 of 25, he says, I appeal to the emperor. So this is to the Caesar, right? To the person in charge, not only of the Roman Empire, but basically of the entire world at this point. Once you make this appeal to the emperor or to the Caesar, like you have to go to the Caesar. There's no going back.
Just like suing in the Supreme Court sort of thing.
In a sense, you're kind of appealing to like the one person.
There's no one higher than
Correct.
and no one else can make the decision because you have done so.
Yeah, and it can't be overridden. So they have no choice but to send him. The problem is, especially for the Roman officials, right? The Roman officials are the ones that have to kind of pass them along to the Caesar. The Roman officials are once again dealing with kind of a Jewish/Christian conundrum. So you have kind of this political branch dealing with a theological question. And so these Roman officials have no idea what to tell the Caesar, like what are the charges that Paul's being accused with. They have no interest in this kind of Jewish/Christian fight or argument, and yet Paul has appealed to the Caesar, and so they kind of say to themselves, well, what are we going to tell Caesar when we send this Paul guy up to him? We could use some help crafting the charges that are being brought against him. So that is where this King Agrippa, starting in verse 13 of chapter 25, and then heading into 26. So at the very end of chapter 25 here, it says, for it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner without indicating the charges against him, right? At the very end of chapter 25. Because these Roman officials have no interest in the theological qualms of the Jewish people or these
Right.
Christian, outsiders, if you will. So they literally have to bring in King Agrippa, who is, remember, kind of like a Herod, kind of this, a puppet king, if you will, but at least sort of knows Jewish theology and background, perhaps. So they kind of pull him in to say, can you get sense of what is happening with this Paul guy? So we can write some type of letter up to Rome to tell them what Paul's done wrong, because this is all above our pay grade. So chapter 26 is literally, once again, Paul defending himself, right? That's all the poor guy is doing. And then in verses 31 and 32, at the very end of this chapter 26, this is where it's admitted that Paul may have overplayed his hand. So as they were leaving, so this is the king, the governor, these officials, as they're leaving, they say to one another, this man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment. So Agrippa, kind of this puppet king of the Jews, says to Festus, who is kind of this Roman governor, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to the emperor, to the Caesar, right? So kind of when all these politicians get together, they say, turns out this is kind of a nothing burger case. Like Paul probably he would have been just let go at this point, but because he appealed to the highest authority in the land, and that can't really be undone, they have no choice but to send him up there. So I think Paul's story maybe could have gone a little bit differently, but I think he overplays his hand.
Well, I know this is like a broken record that I always say, whatever we're studying, but if it was God's plan for him to go to Rome, there was nothing that, it worked out exactly the way that God wanted it to.
Potentially, yeah.
I mean,
Well, God uses mistakes.
right.
Yeah.
That's,
Yeah, perhaps God had maybe, he thought, well, if Paul does this, that, or either way, he's getting to Rome. Whether he makes the right choices or whether he, kind of overplays his hand, I'm getting him to Rome because that's where he needs.
do we know how many books Paul wrote while he was either in prison or under house arrest during all this time? He wrote a
He
handful.
writes a few, yeah, there's
Yeah.
quite a few prison letters.
Yeah.
3-4 prison letters. Because he's under house arrest in Rome for a few years.
Right.
So does the emperor then set a precedent too, so that if this were to happen to someone other than Paul in the future, if Paul was found innocent by the emperor, it would have been clear to anyone that was in the same position?
I don't know.
No,
Probably not.
probably it.
Yeah, I think the emperor he probably just makes his own.
Yeah.
He makes his own defense. Yeah.
Okay. Alright, well, I was trying to think of a reason maybe he didn't like it, but it sounds like he screwed up.
Yeah.
The thing that I learned was the Caesar. I mean, when you hear that, you think of, Caesar Augusta, but that was just the
It's
title
a title. Yeah.
for whoever was in charge.
Correct.
And they didn't always have them.
Right. Yeah.
Caesars were only around during times before when they didn't give up power.
Yeah. So in verse 26 in chapter 26 of verse 32, right? Like my translation says, appeal to the emperor. Sitting there in the Greek, it says Caesar. There might be some translations that say
Mine says Caesar.
Caesar,
Yeah.
but in a sense, the same thing.
And somewhere, it's a few chapters back, but the high priest Ananias, that's not the same person as, that Ananias when Paul was converted. I mean, it's the same name almost,
It's the same name,
but it's not the same person.
Well, Luke is making it out to be
Really?
he's making it out to be the same Ananias, but these are like the same people from way back in Luke chapter 2, right? We hear of Ananias. So is it Luke just kind of using the same cast of characters? I don't quite know what Luke is doing sometimes in Acts. It's the same way. It's the same way that he says just King Herod when describing Agrippa.
Right.
It's like he's almost trying to not have the amount of people he's listing get too unwieldy. I think he knows what he's talking about, but I think from a literary perspective, he's doing something because Ananias was not the high priest for like this entire
Right.
So you can do with that what you will, but I wouldn't get too,
Well, no, I'm just curious.
I wouldn't get too upset about that. Chapter 27, I just have one note. Chapter 27, from a literary perspective, is beautiful. So if you're going to read anything at the end of Acts, read chapter 27. So this is when Paul gets shipped off up to Italy, up to Rome, right? They sail up that way. They eventually hit a storm. They get shipwrecked. But this is where Luke kind of shows his prowess as a writer, right? Like Luke is a really good writer. Mark is a bad writer. No offense to him, but it's his Greek. For those that know Greek, I'm not one of them. His Greek is not very good. Some of the New Testament writers kind of face this problem, right? We can't all be prolific writers. So Mark does his best. But Luke has a real good command of the Greek language, and apparently he was pretty well versed in like particular language around like sailing, because he's using particular Greek words throughout this chapter that are very particular to like the art of sailing. It doesn't necessarily show up in English, and I guess I can't tell you what they are off the top of my head, but Paul knows like this particular region of the Mediterranean. He knows about sailing, and so 27 becomes just this kind of literary effort that Paul puts forth. So read chapter 27 if you haven't already done it.
At the beginning of chapter 27, as you've pointed out before, Luke is using the word "we." So was Luke on the boat when it was shipwrecked? Because when he started describing the shipwreck, I don't know that well, I guess it does say in 27.
There's
it
a lot
says
of
we.
there's a lot of we sections here.
Yeah, okay. So Luke was in the shipwreck as well as we could assume.
That's one way to assume what's happening with the we sections, is that it's Luke himself suddenly he's a part of the group, and so he's just writing we because he was there. Another way to think about it is, as he gathered his sources for what was happening throughout all these decades, he came across some travel logs or diaries from people, and in their diaries they wrote, well, we did this because the person writing the diary was there. And in a sense, then maybe what Luke is doing is he's just kind of transposing these firsthand accounts or diaries so that what shows up in the text then are these we sections. I don't know. You can take that as you like. That's just thinking back to the beginning of Luke's gospel, where he says he's investigated all the sources, right? He's a really good historian. So he tells us that he's kind of pulled in all these different sources and documents and threads. So that could be another way to think about what's happening. Andrew, as you have pointed out, even though, right, they're shipwrecked, even though they end up kind of on this winding path to get up to Rome, it seems like Paul still, although he's shipwrecked, still kind of technically under house arrest and under guard, he's still free to heal and preach and teach. It is as if he is quite spirit-led, even in the midst of all of these.
And lead people who he should not be in charge of. Like, they sent him with 200 soldiers and 60 horses.
Mm-hmm. So he's
And
still,
he's like, no, that's what you sent me with.
so
He
he,
told them to send that.
so he still seems to have this God-given power
Yeah.
that is inexplicable throughout these final chapters of Acts, which
Charisma.
yeah, charisma, but in a book that is very much grounded in the Holy Spirit being with us. I think
There's
it's
a little adventure tale in the end of it, so it's kind of fun.
at the end of 27.
Well, talking about the shipwreck.
Read chapter 27. If you've given up on Acts because it's just a lot of Paul went here and there, read chapter 27, because chapter 27 is really good, and even into chapter 28 here too. Right, Paul's bitten by a snake. They expect him to drop dead at the start of 28, but he doesn't. Right. Anytime something seemingly bad is about to happen to Paul, it's like he just kind of waves his hand, or right, it seems like the spirit shows up and
Oh, walks through the crowd.
he does, right? Or even when the disciples are getting imprisoned, right? An earthquake shows up, or they just walk right past the guards, right? There is a lot of spirit-led activity in the book of Acts. Anytime this ragtag bunch of Christians seems like they're going to get trampled on by the Roman Empire, they just seemingly walk right on through.
Divine protection.
Absolutely.
Exactly. That's, it's simple as that.
Yeah, absolute divine.
Have you heard of
protection.
Alvin York?
I have not.
Alvin York is a World War I soldier who was a conscientious objector who was convinced by a colonel he was under, who was a thorough Christian, that hey, it's okay to kill as long as it's righteous and correct. So he's like, oh, and he quoted I don't know what chapter he quoted, but it was the centurion who does not raise the alarm has blood on his hands. And he's like, oh, it's my divine calling to go in and fight this evil.
Cool.
This guy truly believed he was protected by God. Mortars, artillery would come in, and he would just stand there. He's like, what do you do? I ain't gonna let me die. Where you talk, and he would go out into the middle of orchards and eat apples that he wasn't allowed to eat because every time they went into the orchard, the Germans would throw artillery at them. He survives all of these things, gets a Medal of Honor, capturing 153 Germans and killing 30 in a fight where they're on a machine gun shooting at him, and he's just picking off one after another, yelling at them, hey, please stop, you can't hurt me, God is protecting me, and I will defeat you. And he keeps trying to warn them, and he's just sad that he's having to do this. And the pictures of where he was sitting, because he didn't have any cover, he was just in the middle of a field laying down. And you just see a cone of green grass where he was laying, and everything else around him is just tore up dirt. His canteen that was on his hip had 8 holes in it. Like, straight up armor of God style. Like it.
Yeah.
And you see that's kind of what I'm seeing here is, you bit by a snake. Don't worry, God's got your back.
Yeah.
Oh, these people want to hang you? Don't worry, God's got your back. Oh, you want to command people you shouldn't be able to command? Don't worry, Holy Spirit, it's got you.
There's certainly divine protection here for Paul, up until the point though, right? Again,
no, there's not.
the scripture doesn't relate to us the end of Paul, but there certainly is an end to Paul, and it is death. And not just, he grew old and gray and had his feet kicked up on the beach, but he is eventually, at least tradition says, executed. Now, interestingly enough, as we look at chapter 28 here, in verse 16, he finally gets to Rome. So the front half of 28 kind of finishes off what was done in 27. So if you think back to the book of Romans, when he wrote to the churches in Rome, and he said, hey, one day I'd love to get up and visit you guys, right? Kind of see all the folks who are believers up in Rome. Well, he's done it here in verse 16. He made it to Rome. He just made it there under house arrest, in a sense. So he makes it there not as a free man, but as someone who for years now has been kind of going through the legal system. But that said, the final verse of the book, or the final 2 verses of the book of Acts, right, as he's now kind of been shipped off to Rome, still under house arrest. So Paul lived there 2 whole years at his own expense and welcomed all who came to him, proclaiming the kingdom of God and teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance, right? So once again, this Paul fellow, even though everything is against him, we're still told that without hindrance, inexplicably, he's still telling people about this Jesus fellow. So Acts ends on this extraordinary positive note. Now it's possible that you could think that Acts was written before Paul's death. That is a position that some folks take. So it's possible that Luke doesn't know yet how Paul's story ends, which is why we don't hear about Paul's death at this particular point. I'm kind of in the line that most scholars are, that they think Acts was written after Paul's death. So the Luke as a writer knows how Paul's story ends, and it ends somewhat tragically. But as we've talked about, these last 7 chapters are just kind of Paul walking kind of right through all of these events that are supposed to stop him. And I think Luke wants to end Acts on a positive note for all the Christians out there who are still facing all this persecution, potentially from the Roman Empire, and perhaps from their Jewish brothers and sisters. So I think he wants to end it on this positive note, right? That even though Paul has been arrested, even though he's been under trial and judgment for years and years and years, guess what? He's still preaching, and he's still doing so without hindrance. I mean, what a good note to end the book of Acts, I think.
It's a real encouragement for anyone who's ever been in a ministry position to know that there are streams in the desert that we don't always see it when we're in the thick of it, but
Yeah.
but this is big. These verses are big. That for everything he went through, God still granted him that grace at that point in his life.
And he still had the willingness and the
Yeah.
gut to, right? He didn't.
Yeah.
He could have given up years and years. I probably would have given up if I were him. I mean, for all the stuff that he's faced, right? From his own people, from the Rome. I mean, it seems like nobody likes Paul, right? He doesn't seem to have friends in any circle. But yet he keeps going and going.
But I don't think we can underestimate Jesus speaking to him on the
Yeah.
road. I mean, if that actually happened to us, maybe that would.
And that call story gets retold 3 times in the book of Acts.
Right.
So we hear about it when it first happens, right, way back in chapter
Right.
9, I think it was. And then Paul will tell it twice more
Mhm.
to different people. So that the fact that it's brought up 3 times lets us know how significant of an event that was for Paul. Absolutely. Okay,
What's
any
this last statement Paul makes before all of the?
oh, he quotes from Isaiah.
Is that, oh, it's a quote from Isaiah,
It's
that's
like
what that
in
is?
verse 26.
Yeah,
Yeah.
26 through 28.
Yeah, it's in. So he quotes from Isaiah, which is kind of a stinging. Right before we get to this very positive note in 30 and 31, this quote from Isaiah is kind of a stinging rebuke against the Jewish people. Jesus quotes the same passage from Isaiah, I think, in all 4 Gospels. But in a way, it's for the early Christians, they're trying to figure out why it is not all Jewish people are believing that Jesus is the Messiah. And at times, so Paul especially kind of looks back to the Old Testament and thinks, oh yeah, but we as a Jewish people have always seemingly rejected the prophets who have come to us, right? When God tells us to do something, we always just have done the opposite thing of what God wants us to do. So as Paul's trying to figure out why his own people don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, he kind of looks back and says, well, but we've kind of been a stubborn bunch all these years. And so maybe this is just a continuation of how things have always been. And when God shows up and says, hey, here I am, oftentimes the Jewish people say, well, we're going to do something different. And so that is kind of how the early Christians are reconciling why the Jewish people don't all believe that Jesus is the Messiah.
But don't we do that too?
Well, absolutely.
I mean, it was written to the Jewish people, but we still do that.
Yeah, we should. Yeah, we certainly shouldn't look at the Jewish people and say, "Well, you guys didn't get it right. We're
Right.
the ones who have got it all down." Because I'm not gonna. I don't want to be the person that says, "Yeah, I got it all figured out over here."
Right.
I think there's a lot of misunderstanding,
Right.
even for us. So,
You know,
Any-
Kyle, you talk about God's plan
Right.
over and over. Well, I think that is so true in the case of Paul, to put him